Hey everyone, Mulligan here, and it's time to talk about what I've learned playing Xenan Control, also known as Big Xenan. To start things off, I want to mention the game plan for this deck, and this is right out of the How to Build Better Deck series that Into the End did for Eternal, which was derived from Metamorph's written piece of the same name from the MTG Salvation website for Magic the Gathering. The general game plan is to use cheap, efficient answers to one-for-one my opponent, and then when both players have exhausted their resources, we use powerful threats to either replenish my resources or outright win in the late game. So, I was testing this during the early Omens metagame, and I got it to a point where I was satisfied with the list. There were other people testing the deck at the time as well, and everyone that was doing so agreed it was a pretty solid deck, despite the rest of the community saying Xenan wasn't very good in general back then. To be honest though, I felt I had one of the best Xenan Control lists out of everyone during that time. But after being satisfied with where the list was, I put the deck down and didn't come back to it until last season. And at first the old list did fine in Diamond, but it got to a point where it wasn't holding up in Masters. I started testing some changes after looking at other lists out there, but most of them weren't working out as well as I'd hoped. It wasn't until I decided to stick to the Big Combrei roots that the deck had and finally dropped some cards that I honestly kept around for too long, but we'll talk about those later. I definitely can't claim that this is one of the best lists out there now, but it's something I'm finally comfortable with using on ladder. Now that ETS World is over and we're in the twilight hours of the Horus Traver metagame, I feel it's time to do this video. But speaking of Big Combrei, this deck feels so much like it that it's not even funny. The main difference being that running Shadow actually allows you to kill things rather than just silence them in the case of Big Combrei. I personally never found much success with Big Combrei when I did play it and ended up dropping the deck. After a good build of Chalice was finally discovered, which is the deck we have all come to know now, I just never found a reason to go back to Big Combrei. Xenan, however, has performed much better for me overall. I just like actually being able to kill things rather than silence them because the unit is still a threat afterwards. Now on the flip side, Xenan doesn't have access to Harsh Rule, and I was always someone that never wanted to play a control deck that didn't have the ability to blow up the world. I'll talk more about that later, but I will say that now I'm okay with Xenan not having that. But yeah, the close relationship with Big Combrei is the reason why the deck is also called Big Xenan by many. I am still of the opinion, however, that this is a control deck, and naturally I think Big Combrei is also a control deck. It's just unit based. So as per usual, I'm going to go over some of the cards on this list. I'm not going to go over the obvious ones. Well, with the exception of two. There's two I'll briefly touch on, but the rest of the cards I do want to go over are cards that you might not see in every single list out there. So let's start off with Dark Return. So I've been really impressed with this card so far. I cut Vara to fit these in so I could still have Recursion. I don't get to play the unit for free, but I'm not limited to shadow units like with Vara. And most of our best units are time units, Mystic Ascendant being the most powerful thing you can get back. But this getting anything back to match the situation just gives you a ton of flexibility. I've brought back Blister Sting Wasp to smooth out what would have been awkward early games so I don't get run over. I don't think I'm comfortable going over 2 copies, but it's been fine for me at 2, so it's staying so far. So I'll briefly touch on Temple Scribe actually. He pretty much speaks for himself. I picked this up playing the deck, but some might not, and This is something Lights Out Ace mentioned in his deck tech from early Omens. So in the late game, if you have Temple Scribe in hand and Waystone Infuser in play, you'll want to save the Temple Scribe until you can't play power off the top of your deck. So that way you draw a card and get another chance to play power from the top with Infuser. Unless you need to play the Temple Scribe to have a blocker. But moving over to Blister Sting Wasp, I still like this card. It's just a great way to respect aggro so you don't get run over. Yes, they can torch it, but then that's power they don't have to play the unit they wanted to play that turn usually. And 3 copies has been fine so far. So moving over to Varus Choice. So I've ran 2 copies of these since they used to cost 3. It's always been a good enough card to run main deck in my opinion. Other people have picked up Varus Choice since it got its cost reduced, similar to Banish. But what's funny is that even with this going down to 2 cost, I often find myself waiting until turn 3 or later to play it, just because it's better to wait until your opponent draws more cards in certain matchups. That way you have a better chance of hitting something. The rule of thumb for this card is that against aggro, you want to use the bounce effect since they tend to empty their hand quicker, while against mid-range and control decks, you want to use the discard effect since they can't deploy their hand as quickly due to having higher cost units and other cards. Keep in mind that you don't always want to follow that rule, it just depends on the situation. So some of you might have noticed that I'm not running 4 copies of Banish in this deck, and I'm actually only running 3. That is because I'm actually of the opinion that 4 copies of Banish is not correct in this type of deck. Just to give some history as to why, I ran 2 copies of Banish when it used to cost 4. After it got its cost reduced, it seemed like everyone jumped on the 4 copy hype train. I tried it and it felt so situational. They were almost always stuck in my hand. So I actually went back to running just 2 because I was still running Extract in the deck and was still satisfied with it. I've since gone up to 3 and it's felt fine. It's a pretty solid removal spell. I just think 4 is one too many. So I actually want to talk about Scorpion Wasp next. There are precious few people that actually run this card in their Xenan Control list, and I really don't know why. Xenan's removal has trouble dealing with higher cost multi-faction units since Banish can't touch anything 5 cost or more. These are big guys like Cerso, Heart of the Vault, and Shatterglass Mage. I don't think the answer is more Death Strikes because it's very clunky at 4, despite being unconditional. Running 2 copies of Wasps has felt solid the entire time I've played this deck. They're necessary, in my opinion. Let's move over to Extract, actually. So I actually cut this card, but after more testing, I put them back in. It's good against Stone Scar and Skycrag aggro decks. It's also good against Shatterglass Mage. I feel like Extract and Scorpion Wasp, in theory, kinda go hand in hand. Wasp is used to kill big multi-faction units that are attacking, which is what Xenan struggles with. And fire-based aggro decks can blow Wasp out with Torch, so Extract takes care of most Skycrag units and any Stone Scar multi-faction units like Champion of Chaos and Bandit Queen, just so you don't get run over. Extract can definitely be pretty bad, but I just feel like those situations don't come up often, and another way to influence your draws outside of Waystone Infuser is really nice. I would never play more than 2 of these though. So one other card I'll briefly touch on as well is Mystic Ascendant. I did run 3 copies of this card for a long time and was getting away with it. I finally went up to 4 recently, and honestly, I'm thinking about going back down to 3. It's great that I'm drawing Ascendant practically all the time, but the problem is I can't play him all the time, and I've lost games with multiples of these in hand since going up to 4. Plus, I want my list to respect aggro, so I don't want to cut my early game answers to run stuff like Power Stone. I know I sound crazy, but I'll put it like this. Running 4 copies has felt consistent, but it hasn't made the deck better than it was when I ran 3 copies. I'm still leaving it at 4 for now, but I may cut 1 to fit in other things I want to try in the future. So let's move over to the previous cards that were in this list. And the first one I want to talk about is Memory Dredger. The days when I was young and dumb. So when Omens first came out, I was so excited to try Xenan Control with all the cool new cards from the set. And I thought this one was cool and could work by recurring temple scribes over and over. Then I got a reality check on how to build better decks and realized that this was way too gimmicky and it was just inconsistent. To think I even ran this over Sandstorm Titan. The nerve of me. Next, I want to talk about 2 cards together, those being Beckoning Lumen and Hate Cleaver. And I'm showing the old version of Beckoning Lumen because that's the one I played with. This was the same situation as Memory Dredger. I thought these could work, and I thought I had enough Life Force triggers between Temple Scribe and Ion. It wasn't the case, unfortunately. Beckoning Lumen can be quite the beater, but it was rare that I got a situation where I could profitably attack with her. The more common scenario was that blockers would either kill her outright, or I'd get a Life Force trigger off, but my opponent would have power open for a possible combat trick. So holding her back in order to guarantee the card draw was safer. It felt so bad too because I'd be giving up 6 potential damage at the time when she costed 5. In terms of Hate Cleaver, it was just too awkward for this deck to play this card and then gain enough health enough times to get it to an attack stat that made it relevant. You often want to get Hate Cleaver to a 5-4, and a 4-3 was just never enough for me, if I got a Life Force trigger at all. Next, I want to talk about Shadowlands Feaster. So once upon a time, before I tested Spirit of Resistance, I ran this instead. This was actually a pretty good card. I did run this with Vara, so keep that in mind. Having a big ambush guy post Harsh Rule or to just blank their relic weapon felt great to have. It was extremely rare when I was able to kill a relevant shadow unit my opponent had to bring back with Vara though. And Xenan doesn't really have a bad matchup versus Armory, so I cut this card. There's a chance I could come back to it though. Next card I want to mention is Champion of Mystery. I had finally got around to testing this, and while he was pretty good, he wasn't quite good enough, so I ended up cutting him. The card definitely provides another way to break board parity if you get to 6 Shadow Influence, which isn't too hard to do with this deck. I'd even argue the Shadow Influence is more important to hit than the Time Influence. If you're playing this guy, you can't do the Diplomatic Seal trick. You just can't afford to miss Influence. For newer players, it's where you choose an influence from a faction that your deck is not playing cards for, as long as you already have the influence you need in hand to play anything in your deck. Aggro decks have the easiest time pulling this off since they're typically 2-faction. It's just a psychological trick that can work on ladder, but it isn't a huge deal. Anyway, I do have to admit I only ran 2 copies of this when I tried it, and that was not correct. I don't think you can run less than 3 copies of this guy if you do run it in Big Xenan. 2 copies just wasn't enough, but I still didn't like him overall because while he can be tough to remove depending on the matchup, he doesn't do anything the turn he comes down, and I think enough decks have answers to him. I'd almost play Predatory Carnosaur over him at this point, although Carnosaur is easier to kill and not always guaranteed to do what you need it to do when it comes down either. At the same time, I think 4 is too many in this type of list unless you run more ramp cards like Power Stone. After cutting Champ, I asked myself, does Big Xenan really need a 6-drop for the sake of having a 6-drop? In my experience, at least when it comes to ladder, not really. Now let's talk about Vara Fate Touched. So over time, I've learned that Vara is nowhere near as good in Xenan as she is in Film Control. She's not bad per se, but her ability is pretty inconsistent because all your big bombs are time units. With Ion actually being the best target, even better than Steward usually, her ability wasn't that powerful in this deck. Often there wouldn't be anything you could bring back at all, since the deck is heavy on time units. The only thing I haven't tried is using her with Champion of Mystery, but I don't think he makes things that much better for her. Otherwise, you'd see players running both, and you just don't. There are builds I can think of that would bring her back in and make her a bit more consistent, and I want to try them out, but it's likely not worth it. So finally, I want to talk about Spirit of Resistance. So anyone that has seen previous iterations of this deck, whether on stream or on YouTube, knows that I ran this because I always hated running control decks that couldn't blow up the world. It's just a bad habit from my Magic the Gathering days that I never got rid of. Blue-black control decks had that problem when I played Type 2, which is now standard. And I always preferred blue-white control because we actually had Wrath of God in the format back then. Xenan doesn't have access to Harsh Rule. So normally in this deck, you would hold a power in hand in case you drew Mystic Ascendant, so you could get immediate value from it once you drew one. But Spirit of Resistance made this awkward. And at first I always struggled between holding power for an Ascendant I hadn't drawn or playing the power to work towards the Spirit of Resistance already in my hand when I was learning to play the deck. So it was extremely rare for Spirit of Resistance to see play at first. After enough of those situations, I started to just play the power because I wanted to get to 12 power, and it's pretty tough for this deck to reach it otherwise. There's enough power in the deck, as well as cards that fetch power, but there are no ramp cards. Despite this, Spirit of Resistance was only marginally more consistent, and I still like games where I never played the card more often than games where I did play it. More ramp cards would make getting to 12 easier, and I might still try it. I didn't originally though, because the thought of blowing up my own Power Stones seemed wrong, but Power Stone really matters a lot less in the late game unless you're trying to ramp to something like Mask of Torment. I might try Stray in the Shadow. It was a card that I used to think was underrated, then tried it in other decks and it turned out to be awful. I still don't think Stray is good in general, because in this deck you'd have to play it like it's a Harsh Rule, except it's not. But it worked for Sir Rhino, so maybe it's a good meta call now. It's good against Stone Scar, as well as Dawnwalkers and time mid-range decks, though it doesn't kill any of their other relevant units. So finally, I want to talk about the future of this archetype. This has decent positioning in the meta right now. Sir Rhino did get 3rd place at the ETS World Tournament after all with Xenan Control. Despite that, I don't think it's a very strong deck, but I also don't think it's weak either. It's kind of in the middle ground right now. I definitely play this over Big Combrei 100 times over, if nothing else. It's just a generally solid deck that has served me well at times, and it just never feels awful to use. But personally, I hope Direwolf takes Xenan more in the direction of ramp. I feel like it's too close to Big Combrei right now. That's not a bad thing, but I just would like some more differentiation between the factions. It's kind of the same deal with Skycrag and how their aggro deck feels like a cross between Rakano and Stone Scar, with the deck leaning more towards the latter. But yeah, that's what I've got for you guys today. My thoughts on what I've learned playing Xenan Control and where I'm at with it now. So for those that stuck to the end, I wanted to thank you so much for listening to my experiences playing this deck. So if you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like. For those new, I've done previous videos like these for other decks, so if you want to check those out, I will have a link to the playlist on your screen. I also have other Eternal content as well, so feel free to look around the channel. And if you don't want to miss future videos, consider subscribing to the channel as well. Thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I will see you all soon. Take care.